Welcome to Canonical, the podcast where we take literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Aloha.
Today we are wrapping up our series Life Under Communism. In this series, we talked about the Garlic Ballads by Müller, László Krasznahorkai's Satantango, and Herta Müller's The Passport. Next week, we will begin an exciting new series, Alternate History, Alternate Realities, with George Saunders' book, Lincoln in the Bardo. We hope you'll join us for those episodes. If you would like to find us online, we are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod.
So in a shocking twist for all concerned, turns out communism, not so good. I wanted a series on this topic because I was hoping for layers, but I'm worried that the biggest lesson we got was that socialism bad. Satantango might be the closest we get to seeing centralized power rather than local authority displaying their corruption. But I think in all these books, the argument could be made that we see local corruption as an outcome of poor policies at higher levels that then trickle down to the lower local levels. So can we take anything more substantial away?
I mean, last time we talked, Sam, we talked about how Krasznahorkai explicitly says that Satantango is not about communism. So does that matter in terms of your question if the author says that that's not what the book is about?
It might not be about communism directly, but as we also talked about, it can still allude to that, right? Maybe he would disagree that the book is about that, but it still takes place in a country where communism was going on. And I guess my question is, what is the takeaway about communism?
Well, that's the question that I think is problematic for me, because you're asking for a takeaway about a very large and abstract thing, when I think that, realist fiction tries to deal with particularities. It doesn't try to deal with the abstract. I think if we were reading some philosophical essays, we would be in a better position to answer.
So did we all pick bad books for this series? Or is this series just inherently flawed?
That's what Iad is saying, is you should feel bad about picking the series. The series is bad and you should feel bad.
I think Sam already feels bad, but when we have this title that you've given it, Life Under Communism, I'm putting the stress on life, and you're putting the stress on communism. So that's why we're not coming together here. I think that the books do show us a lot about life under communism, but nothing about communism in the abstract.
I mean, there are a lot of issues with this series beyond what he had talked about. For example, I think part of literature is critiquing the world around you. I was thinking about this question of can you write happy people, for example, who are in China during the Garlic Ballads? Another question that's similar to this is, can you write a work of literature that doesn't critique the world around it? And if you write this work of literature while you're living under a communist state, I guess it ends up being about communism in a negative light. But then you also get a lot of books that are written, in the Western world that are not communistic. Are those books critiques of capitalism? I mean, a lot of people would say, yeah, they are, right? So the problem is then what kind of conclusion can you draw if you're writing a work of literature that critiques the world around it, and inevitably you critique the society in which you're living, which happens to be communist or capitalist? I guess what I'm saying is, just because these works criticize communism, it doesn't necessarily mean that communism is so flawed that you have to criticize it. I think it might be a feature of literature being written by people who live under those kinds of societal constraints, maybe, and it's what they write about. If László Krasznahorkai was from the US but maintained his singular perspective, then maybe you would have a very depressing, scathing book set in a capitalist society. Is their unhappiness a product of the communist state, or is it a product of miserable people who would be miserable anywhere? It's kind of impossible to answer, but I'd say, at least with László, we'd say he'd probably be miserable anywhere. Herta Müller, hard to say, right? Because she was actually victimized by the state more overtly.
Müller seems like he would probably write this kind of book anywhere. But that's also tied directly to rural China, more so than I feel the other books are tied to very specific places. Herta Müller is writing about a sort of specific place, but the events are more generalized. Satantango is very generalized and is not a realistic depiction. At least Garlic Ballads is tied to a actual historical event.
I don't know if I agree with you saying that much of what we see in the passport is generalized. Because, yes, they live under socialism, but at the same time, they live as ethnic minorities under socialism, which creates a peculiarity which is difficult to replicate outside of her specific context. So theoretically, yeah, it could be existing somewhere else, but it seems so specific to her life and her world.
So more broadly then, can you make any comments about how communism is depicted beyond communism is bad?
I would say, in terms of the Garlic Ballads, if I try to get my feelings for that novel separate from my feelings about the rest of the world, communism is not bad when I just limit myself to that novel. There are bad people in this world, but it's not a systemic or institutional problem. So, in that novel, I would say no. There is no criticism of communism as a system of economics or a system of government. In terms of the passport, we do see some cruelty that seems to be encouraged by the government that exists, but it's never named specifically. I think that one of the real tensions of that novel is how people in the novel think that solving that problem of their bad government is going to fix their bad lives. But they don't realize that their bad lives are bad because they are bad people. Like, that to me is the tension of that novel. So I think it actually undermines the idea that communism is bad and fixing communism is going to make people happy.
Herta Müller's does seem to be the most directly tied to corruption coming all the way from the top down, since she does explicitly mention Ceausescu and make indirect references to some of his policies. So in that sense, that's the only one I think that really makes a commentary on communism or communist policies. See, I don't even know about communism in that book. I think it's about leadership and bad policies that come from the top down, but not necessarily communism.
So we have read novels that portrayed communism more positively. For example, Vagabonds and The Dispossessed, and to a lesser extent, Parable of the Sower, even though that's more of like a commune situation. But these books are all speculative. Now that you've read the more realist books in this series, do you think your opinion of the ideas of communism or socialism in those three speculative novels, do you think your opinion has changed?
I don't think so. It creates opportunities for a different sort of lens, I think. But I think those books exist in a speculative space where you can have a more pure form of socialism or communism. They are untainted by greed or human nature, or at least by greed. I think the kinds of questions they try to answer are different from the kinds of questions that we encounter with these novels that we just read. I feel like the kind of socialism we see from these realist books is something that we actually have seen here on Earth, whereas in those speculative books, we haven't seen that sort of socialism or that sort of communism.
I suppose that this is probably true of any work of fiction that, valorizes a certain political ideology. But it is kind of ironic, not in the Alanis sense, but it is kind of ironic that you have happy communism or good communism in ideals in these books where you talk about the ideals of communism. But when you actually get into the governance, that's when you get all these problems. Like, that is the criticism that people have always made about communism, right? That it sounds good in theory, but when you actually enact it, it doesn't work. But I guess this kind of criticism of communism, you could also make the same kind of criticism, I think, of like capitalist literature, in that if you have a book that talks about the ideals of capitalism, and I haven't read Ayn Rand, so I don't know, something like that maybe, like it sounds great. But if you actually have a realist novel set in a capitalist hellscape, not so good.
I think that it has to do, like Sam said, with the level of detail and particularity that we find in realist fiction as opposed to speculative fiction. And if we can set that aside, I think it might be more worth discussing, because I think it's a separate issue whether or not it would make for a good book. Like if we had a book like The Dispossessed, but then we added a problem between peasants and government buying crops, the way that we find in the Garlic Ballads, it wouldn't be interesting because it would be too specific and too particular. It would kind of violate the expectations of the genre. But would it undermine the success that we find in The Dispossessed? I would say no. So I would say that these things make for bad fiction, but they're not necessarily contradictory in terms of the ideals that they present to the reader.
So in The Dispossessed, one of the central tensions is the kind of petty credit taking by the other physicist, the mathematician who supervises, I forget the main character's name. Do you think that kind of conflict, is that not the same as local bureaucrats fucking up garlic purchase, or misjudging how much to plant and how much to buy?
I would say it's not the same. I think that even when we have specifics in speculative fiction, they are presented in such a way that we are encouraged to abstract from them and say this is true in this particular case, but it's true and represents a whole host of human behaviors. Whereas last episode, when we were talking about the Garlic Ballads, we were talking about how Moyen presents incompetence at a specific local level, but we are not encouraged to extend that incompetence in general and say that all government officials are fuck-ups. We are inclined to see this as one specific person who has this problem.
If we are going to draw a connection between something like the Garlic Ballads and the Dispossessed, it might be better to connect with, I can't remember the name of the country, but in the more capitalist world that he goes to, there is a supposedly communist country that he doesn't actually visit, but he's invited to, that is at war with the capitalist country. And the leader or the military figure that invites him says that they have a more pure form of communism, but Shevik rejects it because it's just another version of a statist world, and it doesn't sound any better. And he knows that they just want his idea. They don't want the freedom that it should bring. They want the power that it could bring. But even then, we're still dealing with generalities, and we're still dealing with this kind of amorphous form of government.
Do you think the Passport and Satantango deal with generalities as well? Or is it more specific, like the Garlic Ballads?
I think Satantango is more general. I think that's a very different sort of book than the other two.
It's not speculative, but it's certainly not a realist novel. So I think that it does something similar where it encourages you to see the characters as types rather than as individuals.
With the Passport, I think what Iad was saying earlier is true, that it is connected to something more specific, the Germanic village in Romania, but it is not as specific as, this one historical event that took place in, northeastern China in 1987.
So when you first proposed this series, Sam, I was looking for something written by an author who actually lived in a communist society. And I never even thought to look for a science fiction work If we consider communist literature, do you think we should consider these kinds of science fiction novels, these kind of more speculative novels, as part of that canon? Or is that wholly its own thing? Because it is speculative, because it's more general in nature, it's more of like a philosophical novel than it is an actual novel about communism and living under communism.
If I went to a bookstore or a library and was looking up communist literature, I think it would be fair to organize all of these things under that.
But they don't, Sam. They totally wouldn't. One would be in sci-fi, like the three I mentioned would be in sci-fi in the library, and the other three wouldn't.
Let me put it a different way. If you asked a librarian, I want something a little bit different from these realist novels, I think it's fair to point to these things, but it does feel like a very specific subset. Like I feel like you would have to specify, I want something a little different. For the plain fact that they are speculative. I feel like that supersedes the communist title.
Is being from a communist country the only thing that gives you the ability to speak with credibility on communism?
I don't think so. When we look at Vagabonds, one of the failures of that one was that it was simple. Not that it shouldn't have been written, not that, her views on capitalism were from the wrong sort of person, just that they were very shallow.
This doesn't work exactly just because Anthony Marr was writing about post-Soviet Russia, but one of the problems that I had with that is that he was writing with authority that didn't belong to him. He was writing a realist novel about a subject that didn't belong to him. So if you were writing a speculative novel about like imaginary Russia, maybe I would be okay with that. But in terms of these novels, it matters a lot to me that Herta Müller is actually from Romania. Like, that's not incidental to me.
That's fair, but I will remind you that we also talked about audience in those episodes about Anthony Marra.
The Czar of Love and Techno for listeners who are not up to their Anthony Marra.
Right. He is probably not writing for a Russian audience or even a European audience. He is writing for probably just Americans, mostly. Anything else is incidental.
So I think what Yad is saying is kind of the divide that I'm getting at. Because when you have writers who lived in a communist or socialist state, and I'm not including what's her name who wrote Vagabonds because she's rather young. Moyen actually did grow up during a very communist state versus China now, which is far less communist and more capitalist. I think there's a divide because they have that kind of authenticity. They can speak to it with authority. Whereas, the more speculative books like Vagabonds and Dispossessed, we talked about how they're more about ideas, how they're vaguer. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's because they don't have that authority. So when they try to write the story or when they want to talk about this ideological framework, they have to speculate because they lack the authority. But my question then is, does that speculation mean less than someone who has actually lived under this system or lived with the system? And it sounds to me like, yeah, you're saying, yes, it does. Like to live under it, to have that authority is more meaningful than to speculate about how such a government might work.
I think this is where it gets hazy because when we read these novels about life under communism, we have this tendency, as I think Sam does, and as most people do, that if life under communism is bad, then communism is bad. But I don't think that that's really appropriate. I think that when you're evaluating a system of government and economics, evaluating it through fiction can only take you so far. And if you stop your thinking there, you are really going to get a half-formed perspective because it's always going to be informed by particularities. And while abstraction is not always useful, you do need some abstraction in order to think and talk about policy and economics and government. Like that level of thinking is a requirement.
Yeah, I think a different kind of distillation is when you write speculative fiction And it's the kind of speculative fiction that is like a novel of ideas focused on political theory. You're talking about how it can work, right? Like that tends to be that kind of book. Like Ayn Rand just talking about how capitalism can work. When you actually write a realist novel, you're not writing about how something can work, right? You're writing about the problems. So I think there's a fundamental divide there where I don't know if I want to say like philosophical novels or these sci-fi novels are less useful, but I think they serve different purposes from the outset.
There's also a kind of, I don't know if this is a thing, but you could call it maybe inspiration bias. Like when things are successful and people are happy and content, they don't write fiction about it. So people write fiction about discomfort and violence and unhappiness. So what you find in fiction is always going to tend towards the negative. And because realist fiction tends towards the peculiarities, I think you're going to have a situation where realist fiction is always going to show you individual accounts of negativity under communism. So it will never show you the full picture. One thing that I think is worth noting is that none of the novels that we read were created in a post-communist environment. So when these writers were writing, they were living and thinking about communism as they were experiencing it. And we get a spectrum of attitudes towards the potential of the individual and what we might want or expect from an individual. So Krasznahorkai denies this potential. He thinks that people will not improve or change. Herta Müller does not show potential to reach these ideals that human beings might have, but she doesn't deny that it's possible. And Moyen, I think, is on the extreme in that the figure of the upright official, Zheng Changnian, that we mentioned last week, represents a sort of ideal, a human ideal. Do these attitudes about potential of human beings and the way that communism kind of rests upon the ideal potential of human beings, does this difference have any relationship to the way communism fared in their respective countries?
I think that's kind of a dangerous question, considering something that we talked about in one of the Satantango episodes about how it is kind of unfair to speculate from his work what he might be thinking about in terms of the future. I know that's not exactly what you're asking, but it does feel like his statement is a bit prescient that garbage in, garbage out. How can you create a better system if you still have the same people brought over from a broken one? How is that going to create something different? And that's kind of what we see now. It feels like his book does reflect this kind of broken system. I feel like Muller, you kind of hit it on the head that you're right. She doesn't really show any potential for humans to become like an actualized version of themselves. But she also doesn't deny it. We do see a turnaround at the end, but we don't see, I wouldn't say that anyone reaching an idealized version. And then with Mo Yan, we call China communist, but is it really communist at this point? We still see a country there where, as we talked about, I think in our last episode, that people stand by the CCP and there's an ideal that people root for, regardless of whether it exists. But that's kind of encapsulated by that character at the end, that official.
I guess more to the point, and perhaps more crudely,
cut all of that out, Sam.
No. I think what you said is valuable, but what I'm trying to talk about is a little bit cruder. Like people talk about a Russian soul or an American spirit. Is there a difference between the Chinese spirit that we may find in Garlic Ballads that might account for the reason why communism is so much more successful in China than it was in Europe?
You know, it's hard to say. In a previous episode, I don't remember which one, I think it was our very first episode in the series, I joked about how there were like no communist states left besides Cuba and Venezuela. But I had forgotten about North Korea, of course, you know. Uh, and I had forgotten about Vietnam being nominally a communist country. And of course, Cambodia was a communist country. I mean, a lot of Asian countries were communist. I think in some ways you could say that there is a more communal attitude in Asia. I think that's been borne out in a lot of cultural studies. But at the same time, like we did mention once again Cuba, and Cuba is very different culturally, and it's still, I think, more than nominally, it is still communist. Like, as far as I was reading up about Cuba just a few weeks ago, I mean, they still have a lot of central planning. As one of the last quote unquote successful communist countries, it's way more communist than China. I don't know. I mean, it kind of flies into this theory, right? If it's something that counters this idea that perhaps something about Asian culture is more communal and communist, because I don't think you could say Cuba is in any way like a lot of these Asian countries.
I agree, but I think their form of communism is very different. And I would hazard a guess that people in Cuba are not happy about how the government works.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like the happiness surveys are quite high in Cuba and North Korea.
There are two things about China more specifically that I think I'm not willing to wager that they are true, but I think that if they are true, you can form a kind of coherent argument about why communism exists successfully in the state that it does in China. And the first is pragmatism, which is a tendency among Chinese people. Of course, it's not true for everybody, but a tendency to view things in terms of, does it work? Does it accomplish what we want accomplished? And I think that we see that in the novel in the way that the farmers only become unhappy when the things that they were promised were not delivered. The money that they were promised for harvesting the garlic was not delivered to them. The system remains the same. They're not concerned with abstractions. They're not concerned with theoretical things about government. They're just concerned with getting paid. And that to me seems very in step with the pragmatism that I see in China. And I think the reason why people continue to support communism in China is because it's getting the things done that they want done. So that to me, I think, is quite significant. The second thing that I think is quite significant is a more historical basis where a lot of Chinese people are influenced by Confucius thought. And one of the central tenets of Confucianism is that human nature is good, but most people are corrupted by bad things in society. So if we have a group of people who believe that human beings are inherently good, would not they be more inclined to believe in a system of government that seems to count on the goodness of people and their willingness to share and work towards some sort of common prosperity? What about the Christian background? What about the background that Krasznahorkai and Herta Müller come from? Do you think it is as encouraging to kind of ideal human potential as China is?
Potentially, but I don't think it is held as closely as a tradition. And in fact, you can point to Muller as a good example of where Christianity falls flat, where you have the symbol of Christianity, the spokesperson for Christianity, is not upholding their own tenets, right? You have the priest in that book who is not very priestly. And I feel like that is sort of symbolic for the complicated relationship that a lot of people have in Europe and the West in general. But even just focusing on Europe, they have a complicated relationship with Christianity. I don't know if you can say the same for Confucianism.
What about this idea, though, that the idea of justice in Judeo-Christian culture is always based on a transcendent beyond? You're judged at the pearly gates whether or not you get into heaven. So the things that happen on earth are not particularly important, whereas in Confucianism, it's much more about how to have a harmonious society. That to me seems a key distinction. And also the idea of free will being so important in Christian ethics. Like the reason why human beings are worthy of damnation or heaven is because they have free will and are able to choose the good or the bad.
But even that is a subject of debate, right? Depending on your sect of Christianity. There's whole sects devoted to determinism.
Kind of. They still justify free will in a sort of way, but
Right.
kind of, weird mental gymnastics kind of way. Though I suppose you can say that about most religious practices and beliefs.
Because we're kind of outside of our areas of expertise here, I would just say as a concluding thing here, is it really fair to reduce these novels and the success or failure of communism to the attitudes or the differences between European and Chinese culture? Do you think that the reduction is perhaps reducing the personal agency of these people, these authors?
I mean, I think your answer is kind of in the question, right? It is a reduction. By essence of a reduction, it is probably too limiting.
I don't know. I think some reductions are important and some are not. Like some things are worth talking about, even if they push the argument or they push the idea in a certain direction. I think that kind of pushing is valuable sometimes.
I think there's two parts to this, actually, because part of what we talk about when we talk about communism is the communal aspect, this idea that you are doing something for the group. Another part of it, though, in terms of how communism is practiced, is the authoritarian aspect. And we haven't really talked about that part of it, which I think would be supported somewhat by Confucian ideals as well, because Confucianism is very autocratic. It's very authoritarian. It's top-down pyramid governance. And Chinese historians would say that that's one reason why it was promulgated by Chinese emperors who maybe don't really care about Confucianism at all, but they cared about the fact that this idea allowed them to consolidate power. So if you set aside the communal aspect of it and focus on the authoritarian aspect of it, you could say that there's more acceptance of giving up one's freedoms to the state. Whereas in the West, perhaps it was true once upon a time, but in Europe, people care very much about individual agency and liberties. And I don't think we have as much evidence as to whether or not the communal part of communism is cultural or not. I think that's actually hard to say. But the authoritarian aspect of that political ideology has much more evidence to support it. Well, I feel like we've all learned a lot today.
Have we?
We'll stop here. If you were not turned off by this episode, great. You can let us know on Reddit or on social media about how much you enjoyed this episode, or if you wanted to just chat with us about how we're wrong, that's fine too. You can find us at Canonical Pod. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. We got our first 1-star review recently, I believe. So thank you, stranger, for taking the trouble to let us know your displeasure. Next week, we'll be beginning something new and exciting. George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo. That will be the first book in our new series, Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.